In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Dr Carl Wepking from the University of Wisconsin Madison. Carl's research has focused on the ecology of the soil microbiome, particularly the impacts of livestock antibiotics on soil microbes and their ability to sequester carbon. Well, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. And if you'd just like to start by outlining what you've been doing in terms of your research and what your focus is.
I'm the program manager for the Grassland 2.0 project, which is a USDA-funded 5-year project focused on creating a blueprint for what agriculture in the upper Midwest could look like. And we're doing so with the lens of the ecosystems that used to exist in the upper Midwest, which were sort of perennial prairies and grasslands, and bison and other large ruminants being pushed around either by indigenous peoples or wolves, but some sort of rotation going on. So our big push is trying to simulate that on farms with rotational grazing, and the understanding there being those type of agricultural systems that were here before Western agriculture came in and went a different direction. But those systems were, and them running for hundreds of thousands of years is why we have such rich soils and such great ecosystems to begin with. So trying to put together an agricultural system that can also provide more than just inexpensive food, but one that can actually provide healthy food for people to eat, healthy environments, healthy ecosystems, healthy communities. And yeah, that's the nutshell of the Grassland 2.0 project.
And sorry, go on.
Well, I come to it from a soils background, but for me, it's taking care of the soils is a part of that that bigger picture of the whole system. But I must say that my really heavy focus on soils has taken a backseat to this larger, creating this blueprint question. The soils are at the heart of it, but the different levers all around it are taking more of the focus.
So from what you're saying, I'm gathering it's very much looking at it from a systems approach, and you could easily say there are 3 systems: the animals, the plants, and the soil. There are many people who might throw in a 4th system in there, which would be the actual rumen microbiome, which is a very vibrant and diverse biological entity in itself. So is the focus looking from your perspective, because your background's in microbiology, I believe, and so are you looking from that through that lens or a much broader lens, and where do you see the microbiology coming into that?
So I would say my background is much more in, I would go microbial ecology, much more so than microbiology. Focus more on the impact of microbial communities as a whole, as opposed to sort of, I kind of view microbiology as more individual, smaller scale, individual microbes. And I kind of take the broader, either microbial ecology or ecosystem ecology perspective. And to go back to the project, it takes even a larger scale view of things. We've got people focused on, we've got a policy team that's focused on what policies could be implemented or what policies could be phased out that would help a transition towards a more sustainable agricultural system. We've got financial folks trying to figure out how to deal with things like the burden of debt that farmers are in at the moment within the current system. When we go out and interview farmers and talk to farmers, that's one thing we hear pretty constantly is, I'd love to make a switch, but if I went into the bank and told them I was going to take the cows out of this brand new barn I just built that holds, X many thousand cows and put them back on the pasture, they would tell me to get back to the barn and keep milking, you know. So trying to figure out how we can facilitate some of these transitions with financial tools. We've got a decision support tool team that's putting together some web-based tools to either sit down with, some of them look at more ecosystem scale. So you'd sit down with maybe a local politician or some other decision maker on a regional scale and say, what are the levers we can pull, and how would that impact things like various ecosystem services, flooding, nutrient pollution in waterways, nutrient pollution in groundwater, erosion, all these different things. And how can we manipulate ag landscapes, and what are the different scenarios that come out with that? And then we also have one that's developed for farm scale, where we can sit down with an individual farmer and pull up their farm on a digital map and say, okay, what are you doing now? And input all the different factors and see how profitable it is, what are the different ecosystem service metrics that come with that, and then let's try a few different other things. Have you ever thought about switching this field over here into grazing land for your cows, and how does that change this field compared to this field, and those kind of things? And there are more teams beyond that. Supply chains is another big one, but so we're taking a much broader view of like really the human side, the people side of the system.
Because obviously, you mentioned before that there were, for thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, there were bison running around over hundreds of thousands of acres, but that doesn't necessarily gel with our current systems of roads and fences and towns.
Yeah. It's hard to go all the way back to that, but going on to if you can view that, but on a farm and moving them around, because the more we find these really great ecosystem service benefits only come with well-managed grazing. If it's continuous grazing where the cows just have access to the whole pasture all the time, the results aren't as good, because the cows don't do a good job of providing rest adequately to different areas. So they'll overgraze the good stuff and undergraze the bad stuff. And at the end of the day, you wind up with what we call, in this part of the country, it's like putting green and thistles. And that's all that's left. Is the grass has been munched down to just its nubs, and you've got Russian thistles over your head. And it doesn't lead to a very good system. But if you can move them around and make sure they're rotating, you get a nice, rich, healthy, diverse pasture. So
there's, as you mentioned, the obvious benefits of the grazing systems in terms of the regeneration of the land, the recycling of nutrients. On the flip side, there are the benefits of the more modern systems back in the barn, as you mentioned, where you get the more reliable financial performance and profitability. You get much more reliable and consistent production, both in terms of the quantity as well as the quality and the time the product will actually be sold to market. Are you trying to cherry pick the best of both worlds and come up with hybrid approaches where you can get that benefit for the soil and the land, but also give the farmers the tools so that they can manage their productivity and financial side of business with that same resolution?
Yeah, that's certainly a great point, and something we've talked about. The topic hasn't come up recently, but back when the project first got started, we had this debate about, does it have to be 100% grass-fed? Like, is that the benchmark? Because we do know that supplementing a grass-fed diet with some amount of grain can really boost productivity. And so maybe we can fine tune it and say, 80-20, or you can find some kind of balance that's you're still managing the land very well, and you're also getting a small boost from grain. but it's not something that we've really hammered home too much. You know, we haven't really delved into that research question of like, well, okay, what is the sweet spot there? But no, that's certainly worth thinking about. And from an economic perspective, there are a good number of economists within our group who have really focused on that, especially for dairy, the profitability side of things. And we've got a good amount of research that shows a grass-fed system is kind of the apex of profitability, because your feed costs are so low that you can accept a pretty dramatic drop in yield. And if yield is your worry and your concern, then by all means, the grass-fed system is not going to be for you. But if profitability is your concern from a farmer's perspective, then the evidence we've got shows that grass-fed is actually dramatically better. And it's just instead of paying for seed and feed throughout most of the year, you're letting the sunlight and the grass take care of it for you, and so your input costs are reduced to almost nothing. Maybe you've got to reseed a pasture every couple of years or something, but you can accept a big drop in yield and still have improved profitability based on reduced input costs.
Mm-hmm. That's very enlightening. So thanks for that.
Oh, and I should also one more detail with that. Being out of Wisconsin, we've got a pretty big problem right now with actually overproduction in dairy. Farmers aren't really able to make, and this is why there's been I don't know if this news has traveled around outside of our area, but there's been this huge decline in the number of dairy farms in the state. The fewer and fewer, and the ones that are there are getting bigger and bigger. But the real problem is that with overproduction, I can't remember the way they describe it is, when times are good, you buy more cows and you try to make more milk. And when times are bad, you also try to buy more cows and make more milk because you're trying to. So it's kind of this positive feedback loop that doesn't bode well for farmers. And any time they've tried to put together like a, I can't remember what they call it, where farmers can band together and agree, okay, we're going to cap our production at this amount.
Cooperative marketing board type.
Yeah, yeah. And any effort to do that within the state has not been very successful. So this is another way to help lower the amount of milk that's being produced without harming farmers, and also giving them a better market for it.
Okay. On that note, the Midwest is obviously Wisconsin's famous for its dairy, but the Midwest is very famous for huge amounts of corn and also very vast quantities of soy.
Yeah.
Is there discussions, plans, ideas around the reintroduction of grazing animals into those cropping systems? And if there are, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's one thing that we are working on. And so as part of the group, and one of the teams I didn't mention was what we call learning hubs, which are these really place-specific conversations we're having with certain groups. And we've got 5 of them now going in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the latest one is in Illinois. And each one of these individual locations has their own challenges and their own problems that community faces. And we're trying to figure out, okay, then how would a perennial based system best suit you and your needs? And I'm bringing this up because the one in Illinois, which we're going to go visit in 2 days and sort of kick off some conversations with them, there's barely any livestock left to even put back out onto the fields. Down in Illinois, it's almost entirely corn and soybeans and mostly corn. And so it's going to be a much different conversation down there compared to up here in Wisconsin, where we've got the cattle. It's more about getting the cattle back out on the land. Down in Illinois, the cattle aren't even really there, and there isn't really this deep like passed down knowledge of working in livestock-based system. It's just not how farmers view themselves down there. And so it's going to be an interesting conversation and a much different problem. And so our goal with these hubs is that we know it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for all these different communities and all of the upper Midwest. There's going to be variability. And so we're trying to see that variability on like a community scale so that we can then say, so that it can scale up, so that, we've talked to this one group in Illinois and maybe there's another group in Indiana after that has a lot more similarities with this group in Illinois. And we can say, okay, here's what worked here. And maybe you guys can learn from our efforts there. Whereas this group up in northern Minnesota is heavily focused on water quality from a tourism perspective. It's a big fishing recreation area. And they're worried that right now the only agricultural systems that are up there are mostly livestock, mostly grazing systems. But they're worried that because the winds are starting to shift a little bit towards other types of agriculture, and they're just trying to sort of head that off and protect this tourist hotspot. So very different places, very different problems that they're going through, and we're trying to sort of learn from the differences and the similarities.
On that note, especially the Illinois side of things, if you look at the California almond industry, they have bees, or there's bees that are required for pollination, but the almond farmers don't actually own the bees. They have contract bee farmers that come in and move their bee herds around the state and around the orchards as is necessary. Are there any discussions or conversations of similar types of models with grazing animals?
Yeah. So there's a group we're affiliated with, and I think that this tool was actually put together by a couple different groups, but I'm not going to come up with the name of it. They've been referring to it sort of colloquially as like Tinder for livestock farmers and for people who own land. And the whole idea is that you can log on and say, okay, I've got all this land, but I don't have any livestock. And I know that having livestock on here would actually be the best thing for it. And other people can say, okay, I've got the livestock, but I don't have any land for them. And so trying to make these connections that benefit both parties. It'll probably come to me in 15 minutes what the name of the tool is, but it's something that we kind of point people towards as a way to solve some of those problems of I've got the land but no livestock, or I've got the livestock but I have no land. And while that might not work well for milking cows, that can work well for dairy heifers that don't need to get back to the barn every day, and for beef cattle, and also small ruminants. We've got groups that are working on more goats and sheep, that kind of thing.
That's great to hear about. Well, to dig a bit more back into your area of speciality into the microbial ecology, how do you see? Or just give us an overview of where you see that fitting into the different systems and where you see, I guess, the advantages and any shortcomings.
Sure. Yeah. But so there are a couple different ways I like to think about it. I guess on the broadest scale, not within my specific research questions about antibiotic use in livestock and what that does, but on a much broader scale, we know that the way to, or one way to promote more diversity in soil communities, because we know that, microbes being kind of the foundation, but then you've got to go up from there to mesofauna, macrofauna in the soils, and all of those together is what promotes a good, healthy, functioning soil. But to make a shift from something like corn and soybeans, which is what we have now, and maybe you're incorporating a cover crop in the best case scenario, but a certain piece of land might only see 3 or 4 plants in years and years and years, and so it's not getting a diversity of roots in the ground and the symbiotic relationships between different plants and different microbes are all different. So to go from what can be at worst described as monocultures into more and annual monocultures, with you have living roots in the ground part of the year, at the worst case scenario, and best case scenario year round if you've got cover crops going. But to go from that to perennial biodiverse pastures is kind of night and day when it comes to well-functioning soils and providing, I like to refer to it as like a if you build it they will come situation. Like you're building all of the right scenarios for developing strong, healthy soils and diverse soils in terms of both the microbes and macrobial life within the soil. So for me, it's a no-brainer that, like, if we try to put together a proposal recently to look at the soil health metrics of one versus the other and do these transitions. It was we were looking for money to pay farmers to de-risk these transitions from annual systems to perennial pasture systems. And there was a soil health component. And a big thing we kept thinking is, well, I don't even know why this isn't even a research question. Like, we know that this is going to be better. I guess we're just measuring how much better. But there's no question it's going to be better from a soil health perspective. I guess it's just how far it ticks the needle is what we're asking. But so for me, that's where I come to this Grassland 2.0 project, is understanding that like it's developing a system that is more better suited to supporting life within the soil.
So that's a more diverse and vibrant soil microbiome, essentially, across, imagine, bacteria, but as well as fungi and all sorts of other classes of species.
Yeah. And then the antibiotic side of things is I like to talk about it. It's a very interesting question from a human health perspective, in that I used to joke, I still joke because I'm doing it now, but if you would have asked me 3, 4, 5 years ago, what's the biggest like human health crisis on the horizon, I would have said, and I still tend to say, antibiotic resistance. The pandemic has kind of showed me that maybe that wasn't quite right, but there are a lot of good arguments that the way we handle livestock makes us more susceptible to these types of outbreaks, whether it be bacterial or viral. But the antibiotic side of things, when I go and talk with farming groups, the human health side of it is huge. I don't like to downplay that aspect of it, but my research is really much more focused on the impact that antibiotics going into the soils has on the soil microbial processes, and how antibiotics, just in the same way that antibiotics can affect a bacterial infection on your skin, they can affect bacteria in the soil. And I think the numbers show 80%. I think about 80% of all antibiotics in the U.S. go to livestock. I think that number might be a little outdated. Maybe that was as of 10 years ago at this point. But I imagine it's still pretty similar. And then of that, I think the high estimate was, in the 90% of those antibiotics wind up in the soil, either active or as an active metabolite of the antibiotic itself. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility to imagine the antibiotics you're giving to livestock wind up in the soil in one way or another.
And is that all classes of antibiotics, including the Tylens and the ionophores and everything?
I'm not so sure about the split, and I know that it winds up being a global issue very quickly too, in terms of the ability for antibiotic-resistant bacteria to spread. And I know that even though certain types of antibiotics are banned from use in livestock, in the US, and a lot are banned in Europe. They also continue to be used elsewhere. And so long as they continue to be used elsewhere from a human health perspective or a efficacy of antibiotics perspective, that winds up being really problematic. Just in that, because of that horizontal gene transfer capability of spreading antibiotic resistance genes, using it anywhere in the globe. I mean, we kind of see that with the viral spread of coronavirus, but it's very easy for antibiotic resistance to spread.
So you're if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the soil, the issue is that, one, by having these antibiotics, 90% of which go through the animals and end up in the soil, you're using the soil as a reservoir for breeding antibiotic species, but you're also going to affect the vitality of the soil microbiome.
Or and the way I would focus on it is you're affecting then how the soils work. And some of our research has shown that it's not even just the soils, but you can also affect sort of the plant soil microbe relationship.
Do you want to give me a bit of a background in terms of what those impacts are, how it works?
Yeah. So the research that we did focused on the use of two different antibiotics that are both used in mastitis prevention in dairy cattle. Interestingly, one is a bactericidal antibiotic, sort of lyse bacterial cells, and the other one's a bacteriostatic antibiotic, which essentially, I think it halts a protein synthesis pathway that essentially leaves the cell dormant or inactive. And that winds up having sort of interesting functional effects on the soil and the microbes. The way I like to think about it is, if you're like a balloon, you're popping a balloon, but it's a balloon filled with nice, yummy, easily accessible resources for the rest of the bacteria or fungi that are there. That's going to be different than if you just leave that balloon locked up and harder to access. So with the bactericidal antibiotics, you wind up kind of favoring, it's counterintuitive, but you favor the resistant bacteria a bit more because you're creating more easily accessible resources that bacteria tend to thrive on more so than fungi. Mm-hmm. And with the other one, where you're sort of locking up these little balloons full of resources, it tends to favor the fungi a bit more. It forms a more recalcitrant system that the fungi tend to do a little bit better in. So interestingly, and then you also have microbial community shifts within those two, because one will affect more active microbes. The bactericidal antibiotic affects more active microbes more so than the bacteriostatic antibiotic. So the two things that we found with looking at those two antibiotics, one is that with that, especially the bactericidal antibiotic, it can drive increases in microbial activity, or a better way to think about it is reductions in microbial efficiency. Instead of bacteria having to do their regular day-to-day lives of a bacteria, they've got to do that plus deal with an incoming antibiotic that's trying to destroy them. And that either comes with, say you turn on an efflux pump so that when the antibiotic compound gets into your cell, you can pump it back out again. Or you can produce an enzyme that'll break down the incoming antibiotic before it can get to you. But in either one of those situations, that is not like an energetically neutral activity. It's going to cost you something to do that extra bit of work. And the way we see that is with an increase in respiration. The microbes are working harder to, instead of just do their day-to-day life, they got to do that plus deal with the antibiotic. And so they're going to respire more carbon, and they're going to work through more soil carbon as a result.
Okay, so that's why there's less soil carbon sequestration, because you're actually increasing the work rate, the metabolic rate, and respiratory rate of the microbiome.
And I should say too that, you know, we're measuring that by, we do measure soil carbon, but the main way that we're inferring that is by an increase in respiration within those sites that we've had these experiments going on. So I think part of it, these are kind of shorter term studies. We would anticipate that over the long term, you would start to see these decreases in soil carbon. But in looking at just the amount of respiration coming off, we're sort of inferring that there will be these long-term differences. But so far, we haven't seen as strong of differences within the soil carbon itself, just in the amount of soil carbon that's being respired off, because it's a much larger pool, the soil carbon, than the amount that's being respired. So even though there's more being respired, it's not really causing a very measurable difference within the soil carbon pools.
And have you looked at the effects of ionophores on the soil microbiome?
I have not, and I'm not sure. I feel, you know, I get Google alerts anytime somebody publishes some new work on antibiotics and but no, not to my knowledge, no.
Where do you see this going forward next in terms of what research is needed? And you know, one of the reasons antibiotics are so prevalent is because they're effective. And so, you know, whilst we can say it'd be great to not have antibiotics out there, they're highly effective and they have enabled a lot of increased food to be produced cheaply. So where do you see this going forward?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective on the ecosystem function side of that, because I feel like, again, you can't talk about this stuff without the elephant in the room is the human health side of things, always. But that's not really the focus of my research, other than, again, it's the elephant in the room. So it's hard not to mention it. But from the ecosystem side of things and from the ecosystem functioning side of things, I think a better understanding of the more long-term effects, like I said before, some of the research that we have done has shown these immediate impacts on respiration, but the long-term effect and what this looks like over time is just as important. We've got some new research that we're trying to get published now, hopefully in the home stretch, is looking at what historical antibiotic usage means for sort of climate change impacts going forward, sort of looking at how changes in temperature, to see if changes in temperature over time affect different soils based on whether or not they were exposed to manure from cattle that had or had not been given antibiotics. And we found that at low temperatures or moderate temperatures, they seem to behave similarly. But at higher temperatures, they start to diverge, kind of indicating that even though there might not seem to be big issues with the soil microbes at sort of ambient temperatures, if you do have these extreme temperatures, they can start to shift and start to show, reveal that there were in fact underlying differences between these microbial communities and how they function.
So that would be between a temperate and a subtropical sort of climate zone, or?
So we looked at a range of temperatures, 15 degrees up to 30 degrees Celsius, yeah. And I think the implication there, because it was over a shorter period of time, but you know, if the way I look at it is, if you have sort of unseasonably warm temperatures for a while, you'll have these shifts that could be taking place. You know, if you have a hot, dry spell where the soils are hitting some extreme temperatures, you might see that soils that have been given one type of manure will behave differently than ones that have been given a different type of manure based on whether or not livestock have been given antibiotics.
And what's the differences in behavior of the soils that you observed?
So For the ones that had not been given antibiotics, the microbes seem to be able to, they, what's the best way to put it? Where they have been given antibiotics, the microbes seem inhibited at a high temperature. At a high temperature with, you could imagine more resource being available. We maintained moisture throughout so that there wasn't an interaction of moisture and temperature going on. We tried to hold that as steady as possible. Both increasing temperature, the bacterial community, microbial community in the soils that had not been given an antibiotic kind of explode. The microbial activity really skyrockets. Whereas the ones that had been given an antibiotic, it kind of plateaus at a high temperature. So the way I think about it is the antibiotics seem to be the legacy effect of those antibiotics has created a community that isn't as well adapted to sort of take advantage of those high availability of resources that come with increasing temperature. And at higher temperatures, you could imagine, because a lot of how microbes access resources in the soil is through extracellular enzymes. And with increasing temperature, enzymes can be more effective, or they can hit into a better optimal range at warmer temperatures.
So that's looking at how they cycle nutrients and which will then make those nutrients available to the plants.
Yeah.
And that would, if the nutrients are coming out of the soil, then you could potentially conclude that you need less synthetic fertilizer because you're utilizing what's already there.
Yeah, and another interesting side of the fertilizer question, one of the studies we did previously looked at how carbon and nitrogen moved through the systems based on whether or not a system had been exposed to one or two different types of antibiotic or manure from cows given antibiotics. And in one, we found that plants were actually taking up more nitrogen out of the soil than when exposed to manure from cows given an antibiotic. Plants were able to take up more nitrogen from the soil than ones that had not been exposed to manure from cows given an antibiotic. So control versus antibiotic in essence. But interestingly with that, you'd think like, oh, is this a good thing? Is this growth promoting in that it's causing this uptake in nitrogen from the soil? But we did not find that to be the case. We didn't see any difference in plant growth between these plots. And it seemed to be because in those ones where the plants were taking up more nitrogen, they were also losing more carbon. So it seems to be more that trade-off of photosynthesized carbon turning into sugar, and then the plant funneling that down to the soil. Plants are shown to do that if they're missing some key nutrient like nitrogen, like phosphorus, or micronutrients as well, to try to stimulate the microbial community in the soil to go find what they need, or to go help them access the resources that they need. And so it seems like that trade-off between carbon and nitrogen winds up as sort of a net neutral. So even though they are taking up more nitrogen from the soil, we're not seeing a difference in
having to pump more energy
in plant growth
to get the balance of nutrients they need.
Yeah.
Have you ever looked at the interaction between the soil microbiome and the actual ruminant microbiome?
I have not, but there were some researchers that we collaborated with out of Virginia Tech that were looking at the rumen microbiome and then how that impacts the soil microbiome. And I can't really, I don't have their work too fresh on the top of my head. The one thing I find interesting, we actually don't, for one of them, we don't detect the antibiotic at all within the manure itself. Of the two antibiotics we looked at, it was below detection. And for the other one, it was extremely, extremely low. But we still see the sort of anticipated ecosystem level effects of those two different antibiotics, even though we can't really find the antibiotic itself. So there is some thought that it's not so much the antibiotic going into the system that's causing these differences, as much as it's the effect of the antibiotic on the microbial community within the manure, within the rumen microbiome, that going into the soil that's driving the differences. And I should add, that's another interesting avenue for research, is trying to disentangle whether or not, because it could also be that the reason we're not detecting the antibiotic, but we're still seeing the effect of it, is that it's a metabolite that so we're not able to detect the antibiotic itself, but if it's broken down into two pieces, we're not seeing those two pieces together, but they could both still be active and causing an antibiotic type effect within the system, even though we're not seeing the antibiotic itself.
That's fascinating, and in the way the world works, where it's all about testing and identifying, if you've got no detectable levels but you still have impact, that means that it's harder to work with.
Yeah, and for us, those seem to be the two best explanations. Is you've again, I like to sort of anthropomorphize microbes, but like you've stressed out one option is you've stressed out the microbial community in the gut to the point where when they wind up in the soil, they come in kicking and screaming and saying, we're all under attack, the sky is falling, we're all going to die. The bacteria in the soil hear that, get the signals from the microbes, and decide, oh, okay, I guess we should all be stressed out and work really hard to get rid of any incoming antibiotic, but maybe the antibiotic isn't even there. Maybe they're just stressed out because they're picking up on signals from the microbes that are coming in. And then the other option is the antibiotic is there. It's just as a metabolite and harder to detect.
That is absolutely fascinating, because have you heard of the concept hormesis?
No.
It's when organisms, through various not really well-known mechanisms, can read their environment. So from a human health perspective, when you eat stress plants, it seems to stimulate parts of your body that are protective, or protective genes. And that's essentially the evolutionary concept, is that the earlier you can understand that you're likely to be under a system of stress, the earlier you can adapt and protect your body against it, and the more likely you will to survive whatever that stress event is. And it's led to the belief that there are various small molecules or other communication molecules in that plants produce, or certain organisms produce, when they're stressed, and then other organisms can detect those. And this is what you said there was something along that same concept on a microbial level. So, I guess this is an area that needs quite a bit of extra research. But by stressing, I guess the hypothesis was, by stressing the rumen microbiome, the microbes that pass through the animal will then subsequently stress the soil microbiome through these unknown communication pathways.
I do know there's a growing body of research on sort of how microbes communicate with each other through things like quorum sensing and quorum quenching molecules that get passed within. So, quorum sensing, if bacteria can sense that they've got enough cells around to carry out an activity that would have been sort of density dependent. It wouldn't be an activity that'd be useful to do it if you were just the one cell working on your own. But if you can sense that around you, you've got quorum, that you've got a good amount of microbes there, you can then, once it hits a critical mass, you can switch on and carry out some activity that would be beneficial for all. And I think there's some thought that there are certain antibiotic compounds that actually function in that way, that they can have an inhibitory effect on some bacteria, but they're also used as a quorum sensing compound. And I think that's one of the explanations for how antibiotics developed within the soil to begin with, or within microbial communities to begin with, was as communication.
And is there, you've talked about the effect of the antibiotics coming through the animal into the soil, onto the soil. What's the longevity of that effect? How long does it take for the antibiotics to break down in the soil and the effect to be no longer there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The work we did sought to not so much see how, say you expose the soil to manure from a cow given an antibiotic, and then leave it alone and see how long it takes to sort of rebound back to, or just to see what trajectory it goes on afterwards. That wasn't the direction that our research went in, but certainly this is one of those. Growing up or coming up through graduate school in like an ecology focus, you realize kind of quickly, and it's a good discussion question, but funding cycles have a very clear impact on the type of research that gets done, with the exception of like some like really good long-term ecological studies and things like that. But like you're kind of limited to this like 3 to 5 year snapshot. And as I was leaving the project, it definitely crossed my mind like, oh, someone should just keep sampling this for the next like 10 years. Like somebody should just keep coming back and seeing, okay, we've stopped adding manure and antibiotics. What does it look like a year down the road? What does it look like 5 years down the road? What does it look like 10 years down the road? And I think that would be great research to do. Our work more sought to see, with continued exposure to antibiotics, does the system eventually level off? I mean, does the system get so used to this antibiotic coming in that that's the new normal, that's the new status quo? And that was part of that temperature manipulation experiment we did to try to figure out, okay, they've been exposed to antibiotics, I think it was for 32 months, monthly manure additions for 32 months. Then what happens when you put them off on these different temperatures? And we still see differences, even though with ambient temperature, they seem to function about the same. And so that for us, that was interesting to see that, they didn't acclimate to it after 32 months of continued exposure to it. It seems like it either caused enough of a difference early on that maintained, or that there wasn't really this adaptation taking place, or if it was superficial.
Mm-hmm. And what's next in terms of your research and I guess ways of implementing the results of that going forward?
Well, I think so. To me, this is part of why I've kind of pivoted towards working with this Grassland 2.0 project, is that I do see that the use of antibiotics as problematic from an ecosystem perspective, but very much more problematic from a public health perspective. And any way that we can decrease the need for the use of antibiotics, say by reducing the density, livestock density that then is benefited from the use of the antibiotics. So trying to get more farms, less concentrated livestock, trying to develop agricultural systems that move in that direction, to me is the next step for it. So it's not so much the antibiotic specific investigations, although I think we've talked about, there are definitely a couple great questions that somebody could ask within that about what is the long-term ramifications once antibiotics have stopped going into the system. All of those would be great to ask. But my work has now pivoted much more towards, okay, how do we develop agricultural systems that are less dependent on antibiotic use? And again, like you said, not no antibiotic use, it just needs to be less antibiotic use, more appropriate antibiotic use as needed, as opposed to prophylactic. I think more decentralized agricultural systems would function better from that perspective as well.
And I imagine you speak to quite a few farmers with the work you're currently doing. How do they take those points and those ideas or concepts?
So I think now the soil carbon gets people's attention much more so now than maybe it did 5-10 years ago. I feel like soil carbon is such a hot topic at the moment, given the development of carbon markets and things like that, that farmers tend to resonate with those ideas. And I like to talk about it too, that it's I'm just talking about one little land management decision or one little farming management decision, whether or not to give a cow an antibiotic. But even that little decision can have repercussions on how your system functions or how your farm functions. And so when I talk with this topic with farmers, I like to start with, this is about antibiotics, but it's not. It's about land management generally, and the idea that there are so many different levers you have at your disposal, and each one of them can have effects that are unintended on your farm. And trying to understand all of those can be overwhelming, but here's just one of them, and here's the effects that we see based on this one management decision. And because a lot of what we're talking about now with the Grassland 2.0 project is about trying to de-risk and encourage different land management practices and different farming practices. So trying to get farmers to think about different possibilities, different options, and how they all can have sort of different ecosystem level impacts.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, mate. Is there anything else that you think we should discuss that we haven't so far covered?
And even from like the Grassland 2.0 perspective, in terms of being gray areas, you mentioned earlier, that the current model is really good at producing calories. The current model is really good at being efficient, and efficiency is often what is touted. We can get more from a dairy perspective. We can get more gallons of milk out of a Holstein than we could 50 years ago, and we can do it really efficiently. And so the elephant in the room is always where is that sweet spot of we're getting enough food to feed everybody, and we're doing so without doing too much damage to the environment. And in an ideal situation, like not damaging the environment, but can we find that sweet spot of feeding everyone healthy, nutritious food and at least holding the environment neutral as opposed to heavily damaging it? And that's the sweet spot we're trying to figure out.
I think back to what you said earlier about one of the shortcomings of the modern food system is that it's been so successful at producing lots of calories very efficiently, which means if something's very successful at doing one thing, it's much harder to change it because you've got to backpedal more. And the flip side of that is we've created these one-way systems. You've got nutrients that come from our soils. They get grown into grains or into crops or eaten by animals. They get put on trucks and they go to cities, and then they get eaten, and then they get pumped out to sea generally. So in 50 or 100 or 500 million years, outside New York City and the area outside London, there's going to be some monumentally fertile in the Yangtze River areas. But that's in 50 or 100 million years when the geological activity has uplifted them and turned them back into soils.
Yeah.
So
in the meantime, we have what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico, which and there's some really interesting relationships being built there to try to get shrimp farmers down in Louisiana to come up and speak to farmers in the Midwest, and have the farmers in the Midwest go down and spend a week with some shrimp farmers in Louisiana and see how the two are connected, and that the better land management up in the upper Midwest, the Mississippi Basin, can improve the livelihoods of these shrimp farmers and anybody who's relying on the Gulf of Mexico fisheries for a living. And yeah, it's all related, and that's there's another, speaking of, it's one way. One of the colleagues I work with likes to refer to the current type of agriculture as essentially, it's more like mining than it is anything else. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it as well.
So it's an extractive industry rather than a circular industry.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much once again, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite.